is Ashlyn Warda, and today we're joined by Matt Bienberg of the Goldwater Institute to talk about some recent model legislation. Do you want to go ahead and excuse me, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you do at the Goldwater Institute?
So I am Matt Beinberg. I'm the Director of Education Policy and also direct our Van Sittert Center for Constitutional Advocacy here at the Goldwater Institute in Phoenix. We are a public policy organization. We do policy, we do litigation, advocacy for constitutional education, civic awareness, and work in Arizona and across the nation, putting forward model policies, defending individual liberties in court cases against government overreach, and helping to deal with issues like DEI and some of the content that we're seeing in the education system, both in K-12 and then specifically here in higher education.
Awesome. So, as I mentioned, you just recently released some model legislation with Speech First. It's the Freedom from Indoctrination Act. Could you tell us a bit about it and the motivation behind it?
So the Freedom from Indoctrination Act is really an effort to restore some sanity to higher education. And it essentially has three parts to it. And broadly speaking, the first part is there to protect students and faculty from DEI mandates in higher education, going through there and essentially saying you can't have students who are going through a public university and being told that you must take a DEI-laden course in order to graduate or to complete your major. And you also can't tell faculty that if you want to teach a course, you have to do things like diversify your curriculum. So we've seen pressure on faculty members to do things like saying, that syllabus that you've been using in your course readings, those don't have enough authors from different demographic backgrounds. We're going to pressure you to swap out those authors, not based upon the caliber of whatever they've written, their article, their book. But we're going to basically get a sort of checklist to say, do you have enough people who check this box in terms of the demographics of the author? So it has nothing to do, again, with the content or the substance of the material that's presented to kids, and everything with almost a sort of soft quota to say we're concerned more about, again, those demographic traits for who's writing it. And so the Freedom from Indoctrination Act goes in there and also says we're going to protect faculty and say this can't be something that's you're pressured in any way when you are offering a course, when you're trying to get a course listed, when you're going to be renewing it. None of these can be an opportunity where you are told you need to go change this in order to comply with what we think is the proper understanding of DEI. And then there's a third piece of the Freedom from Indoctrination Act model policy that kind of complements these, and it deals with freshman orientation. And it essentially says, most college campuses, if you're a first-year student, you set foot on campus, and you immediately find yourself in some kind of orientation, a series of workshops, lectures, seminars, whatever that might be. And this part of our model policy says all of that also cannot be pushing kids into a bunch of DEI programming as part of their orientation. And, we see in a lot of cases, and this will kind of get maybe to more of the conversation in a bit, we see a lot of schools that maybe don't mandate this orientation. It just so happens that you're a freshman and you find yourself sort of shepherded into the gymnasium or a room, and suddenly you're being told all about these issues of gender identity and DEI and equity. And so this legislation that we've put out with Speech First goes through there and says, regardless of whether you call this mandatory or recommended, whatever it is, you can't be forcing kids into this. You can't be coercing them. And if you are offering these programs, you have to be offering them alternatives that are comparably marketed, that they have just as many options to choose from. And you have to make sure when you're doing these orientations that you're actually informing the kids of their free speech rights. We want students coming to campus knowing they have First Amendment protections, particularly if they're at a public university, that they have these protections to speak up, that they're respectful of other students' rights. That's what we want to make sure college kids are coming to campus knowing. And we see a failure of that so often in terms of what colleges do communicate. And again, we can kind of go into that in a little bit more detail. But those are sort of the three broad strokes of this model policy that we've put together with Speech First.
That's really interesting. I like the specifics about faculty protections as well as orientation. I'm sure many kids have experienced those kind of shock moments. Um, so far, how have legislators responded to your legislation?
Yeah, so this is kind of the second piece of some of our efforts to push back on DEI. And we saw a lot of enthusiasm this last year of states, and kind of get more into this, of taking kind of the first step with DEI and now having conversations with partner organizations and states across the country who are saying, this is exactly what we've needed because there's been this concern about how do we address this content in the classroom. Speech First, again, our partner organization on this actually did a report this last year that's called No Graduation Without Indoctrination. And they went around and surveyed hundreds of colleges across the country. And they found that almost two-thirds of those required their students to take a DEI course just to graduate. And so that means if you're a student who wants to be an accounting major, a biology major, whatever that might be, you're suddenly being told you have to go spend a semester, the equivalent of hours, tuition dollars, and instead of putting that toward your actual studies or getting through your schooling faster, you have to spend this time and go take one of these DEI courses. And so that's not something that is bettering the education, it's improving it, or offering any kind of real benefit here. And yet they're forced to take it. And so when we've had this conversation with folks across the country, whether our team speaking to lawmakers or coalition partners, I think there's a sense of we need a solution like this to move forward. And so for this coming year, we've got a lot of opportunities where we're seeing lawmakers and partner organizations who I think are looking for solutions like this to bring to their state and say, we can offer our kids something better and some protections for our students and for our faculty.
So, for someone who may not be familiar with the issue, how widespread of a problem are DEI course mandates in higher education?
Yeah, so as I alluded to, we've got some of this top line data from Speech First that says, two-thirds of campuses are doing that. And when they looked at it, that was public and private. Of the ones that were doing this, they found that the majority were actually public universities. And so you think about that, and that means these are in blue states, red states, across the country, and you have these university systems forcing essentially every student who wants to go through there to take this. So you're talking thousands, hundreds of thousands of students or more at a time in some of these systems being told you have to go take this, right? It's a artificial subsidy for this DEI regime, right? Again, it's not saying we're just offering this as a one realm of study that you might want to go pursue. We're forcing everybody to take it. That's the extent of this, and so it's incredibly widespread. And so that again is, I think, why we're seeing enthusiasm from folks to say, if we have a solution, yes, we need to pursue this. Because if you've got two-thirds of public universities, these are state institutions funded by state tax dollars, and they're essentially saying that in order to get a degree from a state institution, you can only get that if you go and spend this time and these funds on something that's really antithetical in a lot of ways to the basic tenets of kind of the American constitutional Republican framework.
And so, how is this different from DEI legislation that we've seen passed in states like Texas or Florida?
Yeah, so we had actually co-sponsored with the Manhattan Institute this last year, what was calling the abolishing the DEI bureaucracy. And that's what states like Texas then became the first state in the country to model after that and pass that. And we saw a lot of other states, Utah and others, come on board this past year, pass this legislation. And what that basically did is it said, we are going to eliminate these DEI offices and officers, all this bureaucracy and bloat and administrative expense that's going to these DEI offerings on college campuses. We're eliminating those. No longer are you going to offer them. It doesn't matter what you call it. We crafted this legislation very carefully to say you can't just rename your DEI office something else. We see a lot of these colleges come up with new words, belonging, or it's inclusion one day, it's belonging, it's all these different things. It doesn't matter what you call it. If you're investing resources into a program which is based around trying to create policies, treating students differently based upon race, or programming that does that, whatever you call that, that has no place on a college campus that is particularly funded by taxpayers. And so that legislation took that first step to really free these colleges from that, really the tentacles of those DEI bureaucracies. But all of that legislation stopped short of then dealing with DEI in the classroom, because there's been this kind of question and concern about, well, there's academic freedom questions. Obviously, faculty, whether you're on the left or the right, we want people to have disagreements and promote ideas or discuss ideas that not everybody's going to agree with. And so then I think a lot of the momentum has said, well, let's get rid of it at the administrative level. We know we can do that, but it's kind of a tricky question when you're looking at how to handle this massive infusion of DEI indoctrination that's happening in the classroom. And so that first wave of DEI legislation really just didn't touch it. This new Freedom from Indoctrination Act is kind of version 2.0 or step two that says, okay, we took care of the DEI bureaucracy, but we didn't touch this issue of the classroom. We are now going to engage it in a way that actually respects and protects academic freedom. As I mentioned, it's doing things like saying we're going to work on the side of faculty to shield them from these mandates. We're going to protect the academic freedom of students to select the courses that are actually relevant to their degree, to get a bachelor's or a college degree without having to spend time here. So we've sort of turned this on its head and said, we're actually going to be the ones protecting academic freedom. We're not banning a course. You can, again, still offer a course in any of these topics, but this isn't something that can then be included in a mandate for what a kid has to go take. And so we've threaded this needle really to say, there is a problem. It has to be addressed. We want to address it in a way that's thoughtful and surgical to solve this issue without kind of getting ahead of ourselves in a way that then is going to cause, either legal or political or just practical problems, and solve this in a way that's best for students and faculty in the states.
And so if this is a feasible solution, why hasn't this been done already?
Yeah, and that kind of touches on that point a little bit of saying that I think there's just been even this last year, when we saw Texas and then Florida and some others came out, DEI, diversity, equity, these words have been so potent and so powerful for years that I think a lot of people in kind of the center, even sort of center left or on the right, who've kind of looked and been concerned about what the DEI regime has pushed, right? These words sound great, and we hear all about these things. And folks are concerned about saying, well, I want to believe in opportunities for folks of different backgrounds, and I want to be respectful of that, and kind of getting walked all over by the DEI regime, which then uses that and exploits it to then push these fairly radical either agendas or components of instruction. And so that's what we've seen a lot of. And I think lawmakers, even this last year, the idea of ripping out the DEI bureaucracy was a pretty pretty big step that had not been done before, and that was done in 2023. So now I think we're seeing lawmakers realize, hey, this was a fight worth having. We've succeeded. We've won. The sky didn't fall. We've saved millions of dollars in places like Texas, tens of millions of dollars of funding saved for what they did last year. Now they're able to turn to that and say, okay, we did that first piece. Now we can come do the second. And so I think lawmakers have realized they don't have to just kind of sit there passively and say, yeah, there's a problem, but we don't know how to handle it. Now we've got solutions like this in ways that it's not going to solve the problem 100%, but if we can, get back to a point where kids aren't just artificially forced into these DEI pipelines of courses, that'll have been a huge victory for states, and I think they're ready now to move on that.
Right. So kind of like using building blocks to get ultimately to your goal. I know that this year the public university system in North Carolina did the first piece that you were talking about, where they made it so you cannot have a DEI office on campus. And we saw some of what you mentioned, the renaming of programs and things of that nature. But it does seem like they gave a best effort for it. So I'm excited to see where that goes. So does this model legislation violate faculty members' academic freedom?
I'm sure we will hear from opponents that charge. And again, we've been very careful in the way that we have tailored this in working, in a way that this legislation, we look at and say this actually protects those faculty. A faculty member can still teach whatever course it is, but just like currently in higher education, right? Faculty, they have these classes. It's the university administration that is deciding, to offer majors and to approve these listings. Just as it has been, this legislation says this governing board, these regents, this bureaucracy that's doing this, when you're mapping out your general education requirements or what a major might look like and you're approving that, you have to make sure that what gets handed down and what gets approved is something that complies with this. So it doesn't say we're going to go in and prevent a faculty member from including certain readings or from saying certain things, but it's to say those faculty members' classes, if that's what the focus of that class is, that's something that students should have the option, if they want to opt in, if it's offered by the university. Now, we've seen a lot of universities look at it and say, look, we just don't even think it's a good use of taxpayer funds to continue offering a degree in certain programs. And that's, within the decision of that university to offer it. But in any case, we should all be able to agree mandating kids to go take this is very different from saying you have the academic freedom to offer this class and have students maybe choose it as an elective, or if they really want to bank and bet their career prospects on going and studying, one of these degree programs that's DEI heavy. That's one thing. Making the engineering student or the architect go and spend time on this is really a tough sell.
So, how do you ensure that the legislation isn't too broad or too narrow in terms of what it covers?
Yeah, we've seen, obviously over the last few years, CRT, critical race theory was kind of what was being discussed for a couple of years, and then, DEI is a sort of offshoot or outgrowth of that. And we saw a lot of these states that did pass legislation, particularly in the K-12 space, that said, we're going to do kind of got called CRT bans. And they'd say, here's 7 or 8 things that you shouldn't be spending taxpayer funds teaching in a public K-12 school. And we ended up seeing, a lot of reports or statements from school leaders, undercover videos, various things of them basically saying, we're just going around that. We're just going to change how we describe this just a little bit. We won't quite use that same term, but we're going to keep largely teaching the same principles. And so those laws, in a lot of instances, maybe were not as effective as intended, right? Because they're still fairly narrow in what they touch. And so you have to be clear that when you're crafting this legislation, you don't want a university to just be able to change a couple words or avoid saying one particular thing and now they can get by. On the other hand, you also don't want to offer something that is so vague and unclear that nobody quite knows what it is you're talking about. And so we've, again, tried to thread that needle with this freedom from indoctrination language and said, we're going to lay out specifically what it is that we're talking about here. These elements of what count as sort of DEI or CRT. And there's multiple provisions in the bill that kind of describe, here are some concepts or buzzwords that tend to get used. But then also we're going to describe, things like saying, regardless of the terms you use, if you've got something that's teaching that institutions are, promoting oppression or disadvantage because they don't actively take race into account, regardless, again, kind of what wording you use, that's still going to fall within what is something you can't require kids to take a course in. And so we've tried to give a definition that's broad enough that it's not so easy to just, really easily skirt it, but not so broad as to be, again, unclear about what it is that we're talking about. And so, the legislation goes in there and says, you can't have a course that has its learning objectives, its learning outcomes, its assignments that are for a grade. None of these things can have this content and be a required course. Again, it doesn't police what a faculty member can say in his class, that he or she can still, lead a discussion in various ways. But it's to go in there and just make very clear that you're not going to have this institutional weight, that the artificial thumb on the scale, forcing kids into these programs that are explicitly set up. Again, we see in places like Texas and a lot of these states, there are these mandates that apply to all the universities or to all the degree programs in a university, forcing the kids to do it. And so we're saying, let's get the thumb off the scale. Let's get these institutions back to a point closer to neutrality where the kids are actually able and the faculty are able to, craft classes and pursue classes that have academic merit to it, instead of saying we're going to artificially subsidize this pipeline through this massive traffic of students that have to go through one of these DEI classes just to graduate.
Right. So, is there a practical way for this to be implemented and by whom?
So we crafted the legislation, instead of saying a faculty member shall do X or Y, it goes through there and says the governing board of the institution, when they are setting the curricula and determining these requirements, they shall ensure that the offerings are there where students are not required or coerced to take one of these classes. So the legislation is geared toward those who ultimately have the governing authority of the institution. Now, those regents might then delegate that to a president or to administrators, as typically happens, right? We already have these layers of bureaucracy that function within the university, and those things work their way up the levels of approval. This really just harnesses that same system and says the same folks at the top who are ultimately signing off on those general ed requirements or those majors and what those offerings are at the universities, the buck stops with them. They have to make sure that what ultimately gets crafted, these course maps, these different degree programs, are going to have to satisfy this requirement. You can't have it set up where kids have to go take one of these. And so it leaves flexibility with the institution in terms of what their protocols are, what their processes are for how they set all of these things. But the end result, the end product, has to be something that's going to comply with this legislation. So it's very clear, again, the buck's going to stop with those governing board members. And you're going to have some who maybe, are more open to this or more resistant to it. But it's going to make very clear to them, this is the expectation of state lawmakers, of taxpayers in your state. No more should this be something that you're requiring of your kids and your faculty.
So looking forward, like what do you hope to see for your model legislation? Like have you yet to hear from anyone that they're interested in picking it up, or what are your hopes for it?
So we, expect to see several states, running this. We again had great success in places like Texas doing that kind of step one this past year, and so those states now turning and looking at it. Again, coalition partners, lawmakers, folks who have said we need this. We see this phenomenon on our college campuses where again the thumb on the scale and there's a desire for it. And so I think what we're likely to see in 2025 are these same, again, all this momentum of states in the last year or so, getting rid of diversity statements, getting rid of diversity officers and programming who are now ready to say, great, we've helped clean house a little bit on the administrative side, but we're still subjecting our kids, thousands, tens of thousands of kids every single year to this. We haven't known exactly what to do. Now we've got a solution. We're going to push forward. And we actually saw in Florida, they've passed a number of measures, and one of them, they actually did put some restrictions on their general education requirements. And we actually just saw some reports coming out of Florida about the success of that program to say, we are seeing already the governing boards there taking steps to ensure that you're not just seeing a bunch of DEI classes. Now, that legislation doesn't address the fact that then you can have these colleges turn around and say, well, we're just going to require a DEI course as part of the major. At Arizona State University, here in Arizona, we did a report on it showing that the journalism major there requires every kid who wants to go into journalism to take a course called diversity and civility. It's not a general education requirement that everybody in the university has to take, but if you want to be a journalism student, you have to take it. And so that's where it's necessary that our Freedom from Indoctrination Act policy looks at it and says, doesn't matter if it's a mandate at the general education level or at the degree program level, it's inappropriate. You shouldn't be forcing kids to do that. So we've already seen success at the general ed level in places like Florida. Now we're going to see, I think, a groundswell of support next year as states move and say, we did step one, now it's time to bring relief to students and faculty through step two.
Awesome. So I have one more just like question that I was wondering. You may not have any like information on this, but so as far as the like DEI required courses, I would imagine that if you're the student taking that class, you almost have to give the answers that they want to hear in order to pass. Have you heard anything like that? Like, do students struggle to, if they disagree with the course content, like how do they pass the class without it harming their GPA or something like that?
Yeah, and that's a challenge. And we actually saw at the University of Arizona, we did a report there on some of their required classes. And in addition to some syllabi, they had an entomology class, a bug class that was satisfied their DEI requirement. And it told kids to walk around with tissue paper wings to just look ridiculous on campus. And that was supposed to simulate the experience of so-called marginalized or disadvantaged students. But we also found other classes at U of A, including one that had a syllabus that said, if you're having a discussion on some of these issues of race, and you say something that another student deems offensive, you just immediately apologize. It didn't matter if your statement was reasonable. Maybe it's a disagreement about is defund the police social justice or a bad policy, right? If you say something and another student says, I find this offensive, you have the faculty member explicitly saying in the course syllabus to those students, you need to be quiet, back down, don't become defensive. Your idea is just simply less valuable here. There's a presumption you are wrong. And it's really hard to see when you have that stuff like that in writing, that you haven't created an environment where the kids know there's a sort of one acceptable viewpoint in the eyes of the instructor here. And so again, that's something where it's unconscionable that you would then force kids into these situations, into classes like that. And so, that's where you're still going to have some of these faculty who are, in a sense, abusing their right to, what should be a free exchange of ideas, who are not treating students fairly. You may have that, but if the kids don't have to go into those classes, that is such a better outcome than forcing all students into courses taught by these kinds of faculty who believe academic freedom, free speech comes second to, sort of social justice and the sense of what is deemed politically correct or acceptable. So it's a great question. We see and hear reports of that, in various places around the country. But seeing it when these faculty members put stuff like that in writing, these students understand there's really only one answer here that's acceptable. Those students should never be in a position where they're forced to go into a class like that.
Right. Well, it's awesome to know that you guys are working to help make sure that doesn't continue to happen, especially for parents and students who are just unsuspecting and don't realize what they might be getting into. Um, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Just to your last point there, there's obviously a ton of choice in colleges and universities across the country. But once students get into a college, maybe they're not giving as much thought when they're making those decisions about some of these course mandates, or maybe they're not aware of it until they're there, and the parents may not know. And now we're seeing resources come online. The Heritage Foundation just put out a choosing college with confidence. There's some of these efforts to help bring a little bit of transparency to what's being taught. But at the end of the day, making sure that families have these choices, that students have these choices, and they're not forced into, again, propping up an artificial pipeline. This is not a silver bullet. This isn't going to transform higher education on the spot, but it's going to make sure that students are free to, again, pursue the education that they need, and that they'll be taking classes on things like American civics and the Constitution instead of DEI, equity, oppression, marginalization, and again, all those buzzwords that we see that are not leading to student outcomes. It's just piling on to the student debt that kids walk out of college with because they had to spend time and tuition on coursework like this.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I have enjoyed learning more about your model legislation, and I hope that it has great success. Um, Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me on.